Awesome. Well, hello everybody. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar workshop for the Run, Walk, and Training program for the fall term. My name is Christina. I'm the coordinator of the programming at SportMed BC. Thank you for all attending today's session that we have going on. We have one of our own clinic mentors or instructor, Michaela Khan from UBC, who's a PhD candidate, going to be talking and discussing about shoe fits this evening. I'm going to pass along the floor to her. Just as a reminder, again, this session will be recorded just for the purposes. If you do have any questions, please leave it in the chat box in the lower side of the screen there. There's a chat button, just click on that and you can put your questions or any further information that you want Michaela to answer at the end, so feel free to put that in. I just ask everybody to just keep their mics mute for the presentation, and if Michaela has any questions for you to answer, feel free to unmute as well. Without further ado, I'm just going to pass the floor over to Michaela. So, Michaela, thank you so much again. And whenever you're ready, feel free to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina. And thank you to SportMed BC for having me here. It's always a pleasure to chat with you guys. And thank you for everyone attending or for giving up your, what is it, Tuesday evening. Feel free to, do your daily things or watch and listen closely. But if you need to cook or do your laundry or anything like that, just have this playing in the background. So I will be talking today about shoes, which is something I could talk for days and days and days on, so you will have to stop me at some point. But first I'll just start with land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the UB campus and presenting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And I always give a shout out to this movie, which I think really highlights the power of running. So Run Woman Run's a Canadian film about a single Indigenous mother who commits to running a marathon before even doing any sort of running. And throughout this process, she sees the ghost of Tom Longboat, who coaches her in both running and staying connected to her heritage. And Tom Longboat, of course, is the first Indigenous person to win the Boston Marathon. So I think it's well worth a watch. And throughout this presentation, remember that running can connect us all. So no matter what race, age, gender, sexuality we may be. So I'll start by telling you just a little bit about me. My interest in running started pretty early. This was my first kiddie race at UBC when I was about 2 years old. And throughout my childhood in sports, I became interested in biomechanics, or studying the forces acting upon and within our bodies. And this led to me pursuing an undergrad and master's degree at Western University in kinesiology before starting my PhD here at UBC in rehabilitation sciences. I still run recreationally. This is me at the same race as in the first picture, but 25 years later. And lifelong activity has been modeled to me by my parents. And here's a picture of my dad and I going out for a run in December in Ontario, just 1 year after I moved out here. And clearly that 1 year in BC, I'd forgotten what a Canadian winter looks like. In the lab, I work with runners from novice to high performance, and I really, really love being a SportMed BC mentor with my great group at the Lift BC location on Thursday nights. So as I said, I could talk about shoes all day, but today I'm hoping to give you an overview of a few different things. So I'll start by giving a little history lesson about the evolution of running shoes. Next, I'll explain some important parts of the shoes. And when you're armed with that information, I'll make some shoe suggestions. And finally, I'll finish off with some quick advice about what makes super shoes super. So just a short disclaimer, I am personally not a healthcare professional, and therefore information in this presentation does not constitute medical advice. And although I've worked with shoe companies in the past, I don't have any current contracts. And although free shoes would be really nice, I'm here to give you my unbiased opinion. So my first question is actually to you guys, true or false, so it's 50% chance of getting it right. And the statement is running shoes have been proven to reduce running related injuries. So have a think about that. I won't ask you to answer it yet, but I will reveal the answer at the end. Let's get into the history of footwear. So I'm going to start way back in the 1800s when running shoes kind of looked like a dress shoe with some spikes hammered into the bottom. And this running spike was made by a company called J.W. Foster and Sons, and it was worn by many British athletes for their Olympic races. And this company is better known as Reebok nowadays. Now, in the 1920s, they figured out a process called vulcanization, and that's when you're fusing rubber to fabric. And this gained a lot of popularity in the shoe industry, and you get a sneaker with this process. So after World War I, companies like Converse and Keds sold them as sports shoes. In the 1940s, there were two brothers, Adi and Rudolf Dassler, and they started a shoe company specialized in track and field footwear. Except the brothers couldn't really see eye to eye, or I guess shoe to shoe. So they ended up breaking into two separate companies, Adidas and Puma. And to this day, those companies are still based in the same German town, and they're only separated by a river. And something really interesting about this partnership with Adidas is that Jesse Owens won the gold in the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany wearing German shoes. Now, moving on to the 1960s, the shoe dog Phil Knight founded Blue Ribbon Sports with the University of Oregon run coach Bill Bowerman. And Knight and Bowerman wanted to create a lighter, faster shoe than the current best-selling, heavier German shoes because they were leather. And they partnered with the Japanese brand Tiger and created a cushioned, more comfortable running shoe. And eventually, Blue Ribbon Sports broke off on their own and became Nike. In the 1970s, Nike wanted to create a versatile shoe that could withstand running on different surfaces. And inspired by his waffle iron, coach Bill Bowerman fashioned a shoe with a rubber sole with those grooves in it to provide better grip on harsher terrain. And we have the waffle sneakers. And innovation continued in the 1980s, and shoes, they started to have all sorts of new technologies to offer the runner protection, support, and comfort. So that blue shoe, the Brooks Vantage, they added a wedge on the inside of your shoe to stop your foot from pronating inwards. Nike started pumping air into their Air Maxes, and ASICS put gel in their cushioning. But despite all these innovations, the 2000s saw a return to the bare minimum. And running barefoot is not really a new thing, but barefoot shoes became popular after Chris McDougall's published his book, Born to Run. And the book is about McDougall's trip to the Copper Canyons to follow the Tarahumara tribe, who can run ultra distances, like over 100 miles with no rest or injuries, wearing nothing but really thin sandals. So after that, a lot of us in the Western world started wearing shoes like Vibram Five Fingers. And finally, we come to the 2000s and beyond. So we saw Eliud Kipchoge run a marathon in under 2 hours in Nike carbon-plated shoes. And just last week, we saw the women's marathon record fell in Berlin. And Asefa was wearing the new Adidas Adizero Adios Pro Evo 1 shoes. Very, very long name. These shoes went on the market today, actually, and I checked at 9 a.m. this morning, and they were already sold out on the US website. So the sky's really the limit, or at least until World Athletics comes up with more restrictions for these shoes. And the reason I wanted to walk you through all these decades is because I think it's quite clear that a lot has changed in just over 100 years. And in 2023, we have just so much choice. We have shoes without a heel, shoes with a really, really big heel, shoes that are really big, shoes that are really small, shoes that are more functional, like trail running shoes, and shoes that maybe are more fashionable than functional. Functional? I'm not sure if that's a word. Functional. And even female-specific shoes. So like in 2010, ASICS debuted a new version of their Kayano model, and they claimed the shoe could tune itself to changes in a woman's menstrual cycle. Never proven and taken off the market pretty quick. But certainly now we're seeing a lot more female specific shoes. And speaking of some marketing, questionable marketing, the footwear industry is worth about 15 billion US dollars, which is approximately like 1 gazillion Canadian dollars now, but actually it's about 20 billion Canadian dollars. And to quote a famous Canadian, Drake once said, "Started from the bottom, now we're here." But despite all these advances in shoe technology, running related injuries have not changed. So, said another way, shoe technologies have not prevented injuries in runners. So, are we actually making strides here, or are we just kind of running in circles with all these new techs? So before I start prescribing shoes, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about how to describe different types of running shoes. So I'm going to spend some time running through the anatomy of a shoe and then how we can classify them into different categories. So going to highlight a couple features. So first we have the heel counter, and this is the piece of material which sits on the back of a shoe. And it can be either made of plastic, which is quite rigid, or fabric, which of course will be more flexible. We have the toe box, which covers your shoes, or the area that covers your shoes. And these come in a variety of heights and widths. So something like a pointed high heel or a dress shoe would have a really small toe box. On the other hand, a shoe company like Ultra, they make shoes with what we would call like an anatomical toe box, meaning it's wide enough to accommodate how your toes sit naturally. Next is stack height, and that's the amount of material between your feet and the ground. And you can measure this at a few different points. So like the heel stack height, you can do it at the forefoot as well, or even in the middle. But if you subtract the forefoot stack height from the heel stack height, you get the heel to toe drop. And then finally, the midsole, which is the layer of material. It's often foam nowadays. That's between the outer sole and the insole. And the midsole is really where we see kind of the most innovation over the years. So for example, now we have tons of different types of foam. So like EVA, P-backs, foam injected with nitrogen. We also have motion control technologies, and these aim to like stop your foot from moving in a certain way. I always laugh at the last picture of the guy trying to like bend the shoe. Because again, the idea is if the shoe doesn't move, then the foot can't move. And then finally, we also have some carbon plates that can be embedded within the midsole to again make that shoe extra, extra stiff. So a lot of options, many shoes flying around. So researchers came up with a way to classify them into categories. So actually in Canada, researchers at the University of Laval came up with what we call the Minimalist Index. And how this works is that you score shoes on a scale from 0 to 100% based on 5 criteria. And 0 is a maximalist shoe, and 100% is a minimalist shoe. And it's a good scale to use. It's proven to be reliable. It's pretty easy to use. And they also reached consensus, so everybody kind of agreed on it. Everybody being 42 shoe experts from around the world. And I should mention that the researchers who came up with the scale also work for a company called the Running Clinic. And I really, really encourage you to go to their website to read more. And there's an index that they have that they've scored a lot of common shoes. And they also have a calculator so you can use your own shoes and see where they sit on the index if they're not already in that database. So I said there were 5 categories to score those shoes from 0 to 100. So let's get into those. So first we have flexibility, and there's actually 2 different types of flexibility. The first one is longitudinal. So these are a pair of my Vibram 5 fingers. So something that's really flexible in the longitudinal way would be something that could wrap up on itself like that. And then we have torsional flexibility, which is kind of side to side. So again, the shoe can kind of roll in on itself. So this would be very, very minimal, contrasting to a Hoka, which is a maximal shoe. And I can't really bend this front to back, nor can I move it side to side. So this would be quite maximal. So the next is the weight. So the lighter the shoe, the more minimal. This obviously weighs less than this. Then we have the technology within the shoe. So looking at a couple different things here. So does it have maybe a combination of different foams in the midsole? Does it have a rigid heel counter? Any arch support? And the more technology, the more maximal. And then we've heard about these last two before. So the stack height at the heel, the thinner the shoe, the more minimal. And then finally the heel to toe drop. So the closer to zero, the more minimal. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the classification. Again, you can find all of these on the Running Clinic website. And so let's move on to some shoe selection. So now that we know the different types of shoes, which ones should you choose? So another true or false question again. This time it's wearing minimalist shoes can strengthen your feet. Is that true or false? And just a reminder, a minimalist shoe would be something like this. And then one more, wearing a maximalist shoe can reduce the impact or like mechanical stress of running on your whole body. True or false? So have a think, and again, I'll reveal them at the end. So when we're picking shoes, I have a golden rule, and it's don't pick something that ain't broke. My golden rule, in other words, is if you are not injured and you do not want to run faster, please do not change anything. Don't change anything. And that's because if we're not injured and we don't want to go faster, typically our body has already adapted to the way we move. So we don't want to mess with that. Now, if you are injured or you do want to run faster, then we might start thinking about transitioning. And it's in this transition that we typically see running injuries. And I hear it all the time. Oh, I tried Hokas and I hated them. Or, oh, I tried barefoot running and it was awful. And usually when I dig a little bit deeper, it might not be the shoe, it might be the transition. And two things are important for that transition. So the first thing is it must be gradual. So you can't just wake up one day and completely change something without allowing your body that time it needs to adapt. And second, to do this as safely as possible, I always like to see the shoe transition with a targeted strength program. And I'll go through that in the next few slides. And this is because I think of shoes like a device. So think about if you were to run in like a high heel, a flip-flop, or a running shoe, it would probably look pretty different. And because there's a big spectrum of running shoes, it's kind of the same thing. So I'll start with minimal shoes, or a shoe that scores greater than 50% on that index. So think of something light, flexible, not a lot of technology, not a big stack height, or a heel to toe drop. And because when there's nothing really much under our foot, we want to protect our heel when we're wearing minimalist footwear. So usually when you run barefoot or put on a minimal shoe, we start to run with something called a forefoot strike. So that's when we first contact the ground, you're using the ball of your foot rather than your heel. And in a shoe with less conditioning or less cushioning, you can also feel the ground beneath you more. So you run softer and with a little bit more control. And studies have shown that this actually reduces the forces in your knees, so the load on your knees. And because your foot is in closer contact with the ground, over time, it actually strengthens those muscles. But in the short term, yes, you are placing definitely more stress on the foot. the Achilles tendon, which connects your calf muscles to your heel. So if you have any of these injuries, so like calf pain, Achilles tendonitis, plantar fasciitis, metatarsal stress fractures, metatarsalgia, if those ring any bells for you, or if you've experienced them, I wouldn't recommend wearing a minimalist shoe until you have those injuries under control. Now on to Maximalist. So heavy shoes, more technology, they're stiffer, big stack height, big heel to toe drop. Wearing these shoes might promote striking the ground first with your heel because we feel a little bit safer running on something that's a little bit more padded. And this type of shoe offers our feet a little bit more protection. Now, I often hear people selecting cushion shoes because they want to reduce the load on their whole body. And interestingly, this is false a lot of the time. And it's because we can't feel the ground as well as we could with a minimalist shoe, that you actually sometimes strike the ground a little harder. So sometimes we see that increases load on the whole body and especially at the knees. And also with that transition, if you weren't a heel striker before and now you're striking the ground with your heel, that makes the muscles on your shin, so on the front of your lower leg, they work a little harder. So for people with knee joint injuries or something called anterior compartment syndrome, really be careful with maximal or heavily cushioned shoes. So which shoe is for you? First, remember the golden rule. If you're not injured and you don't want to run faster, don't change anything. Your body has adapted to what you already wear. But if you are injured, what injury is it? If it's in your knee or your shin, maybe think about transitioning to a more minimal shoe. Or if you've hurt your foot, your calf muscles, or Achilles tendon, maybe you might want to think about a maximalist shoe. But reminder again, the transition must be gradual. And I wish I had a good time frame for this. This is more of a listen to your body kind of thing. When you're transitioning, you shouldn't be in too much pain while you're actually doing the run or for an hour afterwards for sure. And if you have pain the next day when you wake up, you've probably overloaded your body. If you do want to accelerate the process, I definitely recommend training the areas of your body that the shoe shifts that stress towards. So for example, if you want to wear minimalist shoes, think about strengthening your feet and your calf muscles. And if you really want to wear maximalist shoes, strengthen the muscles around your knee and at the front of your lower leg. And good people to help you with this are physios, strength and conditioning coaches, personal trainers, anything like that. And again, I want to go back to the concept that a shoe is a device, and yes, they change the way we move and which muscles are working harder. So sometimes they can be used as like a temporary fix to offload areas of our bodies that hurt. But the part of the body that really interests me are the feet, since they're the only part of our body interacting with the shoes and therefore interacting with the ground. And feet are pretty complex. They have 4 layers of muscles and tons of soft connective tissues. And there's actually evidence that wearing a more maximal shoe or orthotics can really act as a brace and weaken the muscles in your feet. And in contrast, wearing more minimal shoes or no shoes in your everyday life can kind of passively strengthen those foot muscles. There are other exercises you can do if you want a nice foot core like this. In the interest of time, I won't go through them, but they're really easy to Google and there's a ton of YouTube videos for demonstrations. But just to give you an idea, there's toe yoga, so lifting up your big toe and then lifting up the rest of your feet. Toe spread, so trying to splay your toes. When I first started doing this, my left foot could do it, my right foot couldn't even do it. And I still have no idea why, but that one took me a while. And then something called doming as well, which is kind of raising the arch of your foot. So again, people who can help you with this are physios, podorthists, or podiatrists. And now that we're talking about feet, you might have heard people encourage you to match the type of shoe you wear to your foot shape. So like a high arch, a neutral arch, or a flat arch. And actually, when I was putting together this presentation, I Googled like shoes for flat feet and shoes for low arches, shoes for high arches, and it came up with so many hits. And I was really surprised because we actually busted this myth quite a long time ago in the research world. So there are no strong relationships between your foot anatomy and injuries. But I will caution you that shoes can contribute to changes here in your anatomy. And I see a lot of people on the lap with bunions, and they claim, oh, my mom had bunions, my grandmother had bunions, everybody in my family has bunions, so it must be genetic. But often they forget that their family might also have been just squishing their feet into really narrow shoes for generations. So some shoe companies, they offer different widths. New Balance is a really good one. So B is like a standard, and then A and double A is narrow. And then, yeah, we'll go all the way up to like G for extra wide. And then other companies, they make that toe box in more of like an anatomical shape to allow your toes to sit naturally. And if you're interested in these shoes, check out Distance Runwear in Vancouver. They have a really good selection. So lastly, I'll just speak briefly about how to run faster. The last couple years, they've been dominated by super shoes. So with the Breaking 2 effort, we caught the first glimpse of Nike's prototype super shoes. And these shoes were so fast that even athletes that were sponsored by other companies were getting permission to wear these new Nike shoes. And nowadays, these shoes are much more popular. I've seen them on elite runners, I've seen them in teenagers, I've seen them on a 6-hour marathoner. And most of the shoe companies, they've caught up with Nike and have their own version of a carbon plated shoe. So there's a few things that do make these shoes super. So first is the midsole material innovation. They're made with really highly responsive foams. So basically these new really light foams, they return more energy after they're compressed more than any other foam. Next is the carbon plate or plates. World Athletics will only allow you to have one, but they're having prototypes made with more. And this makes the plate, or this plate makes the shoe really stiff, so your toes don't bend as much when you run. And from a biomechanics perspective, that's a little bit more economical. And lastly, they're really lightweight. And studies have shown that for every 100 grams you add to a shoe, you become 1% less economical. But importantly, researchers say that it isn't one thing that makes super shoes super, rather it's kind of a combination of all these things together. But are they worth it? My animations are a little bit out here. So first, they cost a lot of money. So those shoes that I mentioned that were worn by the female winner of the Berlin Marathon that went on the market today, they cost $500 US. And not only do they cost $500 US, we have some durability concerns with these shoes because they're only meant to be worn once. So if you have that much money to spend on a pair of shoes, kudos. I don't currently on my student budget, but I would love to get my hands on a pair. But definitely things to take into consideration. And then earlier in January this year, there was a paper looking at bone stress injury, so stress fractures, in runners using these new carbon fiber plated shoes. There's a few problems with the studies. It was a case study, so they only looked at 5 runners, and those runners had some interesting histories of previous stress fractures. One just woke up one day and like ran a half marathon. So a couple confounding factors. But I have no doubt we're going to start seeing more things like this. Again, that transition from a normal running shoe to something really stiff. Injuries happen in that transition. And if they're not transitioned well, bone stress injuries could occur. So if you're looking to go faster and looking for a little bit more of a safer option, or maybe a little bit more economical with a little bit more durability, I would start with just lighter shoes. See if you can get something lighter. So to summarize that, we have our questions. So running shoes have been proven to reduce running related injuries. Unfortunately, this is false. We're not there yet. But I know we're always fed marketing saying this is the shoe that you're not gonna be injured in. Nobody gets injured in these shoes. Unfortunately, false. Second question, wearing minimalist shoes, like my 5 fingers, can strengthen your feet. This is true, although don't wake up tomorrow and go out and buy a pair. If you do, make sure you're transitioning properly into them. Otherwise, it's going to maybe place a lot more load on your feet and it will be above your tolerance level and end up being quite painful. And last question, wearing maximalist shoes can reduce the impact of running on your whole body. This is false. Sometimes when we can't feel the ground underneath us, we actually end up running harder into the ground, and the impact is much higher. So take-home messages. Shoes, they've changed a lot, but running-related injuries, unfortunately, have not. If you want to take a look at what you're currently wearing, go to the Running Clinic's website and you can classify your own shoes with the Minimalist Index. We saw that shoes, whether they're minimal or maximal, can be used to shift load from one area to another. So wearing minimalist shoes might be a little harder on your feet, your Achilles tendon, your calf, but lighter on your knees. Whereas maximalist shoes, they're a little harder on your knees and the front of your leg, but maybe better for foot injuries. And we know that super shoes are fast, but at what cost? Physically and your bank account. So last, I'll just take you through some ongoing research at UBC. So one of our big studies is we're looking at how knee cartilage responds to running. So it's a 12-week running program. And at the beginning, we do a biomechanics assessment and an MRI. So we'll get to know you and how you move, and then take pictures of your knee with our big fancy camera. Then we send you on that 12-week running program aimed to increase your mileage before repeating all of the biomechanics and the MRI assessment at the end. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, this is our biomechanics assessment. So it's like the movie is kind of CGI, except we're making you into like a running model, not a cool dinosaur or an avatar. So yeah, we place all those stickers on you and we have some cameras, some glowing red cameras around the room, and we use that to capture your motion. And when we process it, it ends up looking like this. So again, not a dinosaur, but a cool stick model. And then the MRI, we have a really fancy MRI that we're very thankful for. It's like almost a spa experience. You get to change the lights, listen to music. It's quite fun. And we use that to take pictures of your knees to see how running affects your knee cartilage. So with that, thank you so much, Fort Med BC, again for having me talk about shoes. I've included my Twitter handle. I tweet sometimes. I'm biased, but I think it's good stuff. My email address if you want to ask me any questions, and also just the recruiting information for the study that I just talked about. So happy to open up to questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Michaela, for that insightful introduction and just giving yourself about you and what you do, and as well that whole information about shoes. I have a couple of questions to start off. One thing that I want to touch about is I know a lot of people do a certain type of cross training. I know you mentioned of looking at the different shoes and like the different widths that you need and attaining that. What kind of shoes would you prefer somebody wear if they're doing like running on sand and beaches as well as trails? Is that the same whole dynamic you want to look on, like, running on concrete, or do you want to look at something a little bit more different since on the, like you mentioned before, it's all based on how your foot's reacting to the ground?
That's a really good question. I know Vancouver, we've seen so many trail runners in our lab that I get this question a lot. with trail running, I think I'd go with the same philosophy, except for the fact you'll definitely want, we call them lugs, so the little like pointy out bits in the shoes. Um, a little bit longer ones to give you a little bit more grip. Maybe consider Gore-Tex since it's often kind of rainy. Um, but in terms of like shoes for running uphill and downhill, we just don't have enough information about that biomechanically yet. And that's really because all our assessments are constrained to the lab. So it's really hard to take those cameras and our force plates out into the trail, although that would be really, really lovely. So we don't have that information yet. I know people who they don't wear barefoot shoes, but they really like running barefoot in the sand. Uh, One, I wouldn't recommend running barefoot on concrete, even though I see people doing that on the seawall and on the greenway. Um, but yeah, just a little bit softer surface to work those feet.
My next question for you too is I know a lot are prone to, ankle injuries and such. So if somebody is having that ankle injury, a lot of what I've heard from practitioners in the past is to wear a minimalistic shoe so you support that ankle and those muscles there. Is that something that you want to continue with if you do get an injury? Like, is it a good idea for people to wear like an ankle support brace with a minimalistic shoe, or should they just, just stick to a minimalistic shoe and rehabilitate themselves that way?
Yeah, that's good advice from the physio to wear a more minimal shoe. I actually worry a lot about ankle injuries in like those big maximal shoes. Um, so is it a good idea to wear both a brace and a minimal shoe? They're kind of countering each other. So if you have an acute injury, you're in that kind of protect phase, um, where you want to not really overload the muscles and the tissues in your ankle. So I'd suggest maybe going to something a little bit more maximal and wearing that ankle brace, but always transitioning back with that strength program. And if you want to get back to minimal shoes, no issue with that as long as your body can handle it.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else in the Zoom session have any questions? I have a couple more for Michaela to answer, so feel free to chime in. One thing that you were mentioning was foot exercises. Is it a good idea for people to just continue with those foot exercises or purchase, those foot spacers that I've seen that a lot of happening. Do you suggest having those types of accessories sort of enhance sort of that foot alignment in a way?
Yeah, I personally I own toe spacers, and I have tried them out. The thing with toe spacers is they won't like correct the what is called like a deviation or the anatomy. Um, and I don't even know if we have good evidence that those foot strengthening exercise will fix the anatomical variation anyway. But I think it's more about like preventing further um, deviations in your anatomy. So toe spacers, they're kind of like a brace in that they're a passive treatment, and I would always advocate for the active muscle strengthening treatment before. But do I do my toe exercises and wear my foot spacers to bed? Yeah, I do.
That's a good I noticed I have some too, so I was like always thinking like is that an aspect that really helps? But I've noticed it because I know you're mentioning about like before with the foot shape. That's why I really like New Balance. Like you said, they have the different width size. So sort of my next question to you, have you I don't know with your guys' study are pertaining to, is it a factual understanding that the sides of your width of your foot at a younger age, if you get an actual certain wider foot, it's sort of your foot grows specifically. I've seen a couple of like articles, research articles pertaining, at a young age, a lot of people put their children in shoes, but knowing which is the right width to shoes of their child so they don't like um, sort of their foot doesn't model into those shoes. What's your recommendations for that? Of like, some people are grandparents or up and coming and have kids. Like, what are some other things that, pertaining to running that we always look into a shoe? What should their day to day for other people, specifics to look at?
What I would love to see happen is kids being in minimal shoes from when they're young. I We've gone through so many different technologies, and I don't want to say we're moving backwards, but I think there's a lot we can gain by like starting our lives with strong feet. Um, Even personally, I used to wear a lot of maximal shoes, and then I had an injury and my arches collapsed. And it wasn't until that I transitioned to barefoot shoes that I got my arch back and my feet were healthier. Um, and this happens quite often. I sometimes cringe when I walk around campus and there's like Fila shoes. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're like this tall and they're so stiff. And I'm like, oh man, it's just like an orthopedic boot for your shoe or for your foot, and you don't need it. Um, so yeah, getting them started on with like either just spending a lot of time bare feet or in very, very minimal shoes that have what we call an anatomical last. So you can tell if you take your shoe and you put your foot right over it, and if your foot is hanging off the sides in any way, then your shoe is too narrow for you. And you might be surprised with a lot of your shoes how narrow they really are and how much you are squishing your foot into them. But I just had this conversation with my dad the other day. He's like, my running shoes are so pointy. Like, why don't they make shoes that fit my toes? And I'm like, okay, they do make shoes like that. You just haven't asked me yet. Or I haven't told you about them. But it's funny he just like came up with that on his own. I was like, I'm gonna take you to distance runway. We're gonna figure. We're gonna sort you out.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people when they're going into shoes and seeing it, right? A lot of their first thing is like you see what other people are wearing, then you go try them on, and then like everybody does a research to what they're wearing. But like you mentioned, it all goes to your anatomy of your foot and how to pertain it and keeping it that way. My next follow-up question to you is, I know you touched a little bit, but knowing when to replace your shoe.
Yeah.
One thing I know sometimes when I look at bottom of my shoes and I flip them over, and anybody could do this when they get home. In certain shoes, I see like my back of my heel starts to rear down, and to me, I'm like noticing, is that where the most of like my weight's coming from and that pushing is? So my question to you is like, sometimes your shoes can get disformulated just because of your weight and distribution. Where does a good time to come and being like, okay, this is a new sense of a new shoe or a new structure, or what does that information provide so you can know what your next step with shoes?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think often you'll go into a shoe store and they'll look at your shoe and say, oh, I can see you've worn down this side of your shoe. That means you need a motion control or this and that. And again, that's a transition. And you should, unless there's been an acute change, like an acute injury, you're still adapted to the way you've run. So if you have always worn down your shoes in that way and you're not in pain, you're not injured, then that's okay. Now, when to replace your shoes, I do kind of the wobble test. So if I put my shoe in a flat surface and just kind of touch it like that, and if it keeps wobbling, then maybe it's time. And also, if you've seen your foam is really, really thin, maybe that's time too. But the funny thing is, you've been continuously adapting to that less responsive foam. So I know people who only change their shoes when they put holes through them. Other people are like, no, I have to have like fast shoes all the time. So then they just like get conditioned to new shoes and then have to get new shoes all the time. So
Hmm.
there's no right or wrong. And there's definitely not like, oh, replace your shoes after 600 kilometers. That was kind of made up by shoe companies to sell more shoes. Yeah.
So
I have a I have a follow-up sort of question to that. There's a lot of runners that will rotate through 3 or 4 different pairs of shoes.
Yes.
So that you're kind of prolonging that having to change out your shoe. Now, do you think that's of value, or do you think, it may like affect something within, especially if it's a different style of shoe? Like I've got on running shoes, I've got New Balance and I've got Asics that I rotate through. So like,
Yeah.
does the different ones kind of affect your muscles differently, and is that kind of harmful, I guess?
I'm glad you brought that up. So there's only been like one official research study looking at people who like go through multiple pairs of shoes. And I wish there was more because like nowadays you're hard pressed to find a runner who only has one running shoe. So that study was only observational, so they kind of just like tracked people over time. And they found that people with more pairs of shoes were injured less. It's never been replicated, but we think it's yeah, because when you're continuously like adapting to different pairs of shoes, so you're working different muscles and you're making sure like every part of your foot and lower limb, they're getting stronger. So I always advocate for multiple pairs of shoes if it's available to you. I sometimes run in these, but then when my Achilles starts to hurt, I start running in like these. Um, I've never got up to this, but I wouldn't rule it out if my foot's hurting. I've had like foot stress fracture and injuries in the past. So if that ever comes back, then yeah, I'm going to be wearing these. So I use it more as like a device, like, oh, what's hurting me today? Do I want to run really fast? Then I'm going to put my lightest shoe on. So kind of working through like the flow chart in my mind.
Michaela, do you have any feedback, like any tips of how to break in a shoe or sort of ideas? Because I know sometimes when people get their shoes on, they get the foot cramps and that type of deal. Do you have any tricks to the trade?
Um, wear them gradually, like the old, like wear them around the house. Like I 100% advocate for that. I wish that shoes came with like, I don't know, some sort of recycling program that you wear them for a month, see how they are, and if you don't like them, you can return them and get another pair. Like I really think that would solve like the majority of foot injuries. So if you know of any company that does that, awesome. They have my business. But for breaking them in, like I've heard all sorts of things like, oh, people will go out and like run for 2 minutes in their new shoe, and then so they'll do like a lap around the block, and then they'll switch into their old shoes and finish their run. And then next time they go running, they'll run for 5 minutes, and then they circle back to their house and like then put on their old shoes. That's like a pretty drastic way. That's a safe way. But really start slow and gradual. Listen to your body. If you have tons of pain during the run, you've gone too far. If you have pain an hour after the run, you've gone too far. If you have pain the next day when you wake up, too far. Dial it back.
Fair enough. And my last final question, just to wrap up this evening, if no one else has it. I know there's a different ways of tying your shoelaces. I know there's all these different styles. Have you known any type of research or anything inquiring of different styles and ways to do it? Has that helped with sort of the running mechanism and the strength and aspects to that?
Surprisingly, I haven't seen much research on it. Um, Usually we're having a different time just because, or like a different challenge because there's so many types of shoes. So laces don't really, yeah, they haven't really entered the conversation as much, but that's a really good point. Um, Whatever is comfortable for you. There's some researchers out of Calgary that they came up with like the comfort filter. So like the shoe that's best for you is the most comfortable one. Um,
Okay.
but then it's hard to imagine people are like wearing shoes uncomfortably. But then also I read a stat the other day that like 72% of older runners are uncomfortable in their shoes. And I'm like, this is crazy. Are we comfortable? Are we not comfortable? Like,
Oh,
what is happening? So it's very convoluted.
fair enough.
So to answer your questions, I don't know any
Comfort
best
is key.
lacing. Yeah, comfort is key, but maybe not key. We don't know.
Yeah.
We're confused.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's why we always got to do all with the research, right? That's always the thing that the factual, trying to get as much information as possible. So I really thank you and enjoy your speech in this tonight's session. um, everybody that's doing the work at UBC. That is just very great to see that you guys are doing something like this. So everybody will be sending out more further information on how you can get in contact and how to be a part of it. So thank you for attending. If there's any further questions we have, you can feel free to send it to Michaela through her contact information as well. But thank you for night for joining for our Zoom session. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm just gonna
See you next
stop
time.
recording.